Westpac's share price surges after the bank reports a bumper profit. The Reserve Bank Board meets today with economists expecting another 25 basis point rate hike. And are we beyond peak Melbourne Cup? Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It's Tuesday, the 7th of November 2023. I'm Adam Lang, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Adam.
Sean, immediately after the show, we want everyone to stay listening for your chat with Tom Riley. He's the Chief Executive of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, and what a good interview to have today.
Well, very appropriate for Melbourne Cup Day. He talks about how much prize money there is out there and racing land, the state of the industry, some of the really big issues, obviously the gaming and betting, what's going to happen there, welfare of horses, etc. Very appropriate for Melbourne Cup Day. And Tom is a terrific fella, so well worth a listen, that one.
Great. The main story this morning, Sean, Westpac has reported a 26% jump in net profit to more than $7 billion, thanks to more activity in its business and institutional operations.
Westpac's full year 2023 results are a welcome relief for shareholders who have watched the bank go from number 2 financial institution behind Commonwealth Bank to number 4 over the past year or so. But it's been longer than that. There's been all sorts of challenges for that particular bank over the last 5 or 6 years. After yesterday's 2% rise in its share price, Westpac is now about the same size as ANZ in terms of market capitalisation. Still well behind National Australia Bank, though, and obviously behind Commonwealth Bank. Helping the rise yesterday was a $1.5 billion share buyback announcement and a 14% increase in dividends as part of that full year profit for the 12 months to the end of September.
Sean, there's some movement in the top 4 bank rankings. What about the details? Is this a good result for Westpac?
Hard to say. Based on the share price it is, there's certainly plenty in the result. The all-important net interest margin, essentially the difference between what a bank pays on deposits versus receives on loans, was up a touch for the year, but down in the second half due to competition in the mortgage market. Westpac has been competing hard to win market share in the home loan arena. Some metrics used to judge performance, such as return on equity, earnings per share, and of course, net profit, the bottom line, all improved. But Westpac still has a higher cost-to-income ratio. Effectively, it's not as efficient as the other banks. Westpac will reduce the number of technology systems it runs from 180. Imagine that, looking after 180 technology systems. Wants to get it down to 60. They'll spend $2 billion a year to do so. Ever since it bought St George Bank back in 2008, it's been running a myriad of technology platforms. Westpac lifted provisions for bad loans, though, given we've had 12 interest rate rises since May last year. Stressed loans still sit at just 1.26%. That's pretty good. CEO Peter King said there hasn't been a significant increase in customers falling behind. In terms of the outlook, operating conditions got tougher in the most recent 6 months, King said. That's expected to continue into next year.
Sean, turning to the local share market, how did it perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed up 0.3% to 6,997 points, having briefly popped up above 7,000 points in late afternoon trading. All the banks did well on the back of that Westpac result. The healthcare stocks were among the best performers, with CSL leading the way, rising nearly 2%. ResMed jumped 3%. The iron ore and energy stocks were lower, so too the retailers. Telstra had a bad day as well. In corporate news, Goodman Group forecast its operating earnings per share growth of 9% for this current financial year. That's about what was expected. And boss Greg Goodman said interest rates, credit and inflation remain the key drivers of uncertainty in the real estate sector. Best on the day was Iris, the tech group. It was up 8%. Block Inc. was the worst. It fell 6%, though it did jump 25% on Friday. So perhaps that fallback wasn't unexpected yesterday.
And Sean, what's happening around the world? What's happening in international markets?
Saudi Arabia and Russia reaffirmed that they'll stick with oil supply cuts of more than 1 million barrels a day until the end of the year, even as turmoil in the Middle East hits global markets. That will keep pressure on oil prices and, of course, the price we pay at the petrol bowser. Brent crude is trading above $85 a barrel. Gold prices have come off a bit. The Aussie dollar is trading above 65 US cents.
We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese yesterday said his engagement with China's President Xi Jinping has been positive and constructive, and Xi has always honoured his word.
Albanese was asked whether he trusted the Chinese leader. His response, he didn't quite say yes, but he said, "He has never said anything to me that has not been done, and that is a positive way you have to start off dealing with people." My job is to represent Australia's national interests. He's the leader of a different nation with different interests. All that is very true. I'm not quite sure whether he said he trusted him or not at the end of that. Anyway, Albanese said the relationship nowadays is driven by diplomacy, adding that it has changed a lot over its 50-year history. Of course, 50 years ago was when Gough Whitlam became the first Prime Minister to visit China.
Sean, Medicare, unemployment and child support payments will be processed more quickly using 3,000 extra Services Australia staff.
Yeah, good news hit this. Government Services Minister Bill Shorten yesterday announced a $228 million spending increase to get more staff to help at Centrelink, Medicare and child support. The extra funds were agreed to after a blowout in call waiting and claim processing times at Services Australia amid a sharp increase in claims and queries. Services Australia undertakes $1.1 billion transactions online annually, with $220 billion paid out in support payments. Meanwhile, crossbench senators want the government's industrial relations omnibus bill to be split into 5 separate pieces of legislation. Senators David Pocock and Jackie Lambie introduced 4 private member bills into the upper house yesterday, seeking to break up the less contentious parts of the government's closing loopholes bill. That particular piece of legislation is going to be the centre of a terrific bun fight, I would say. Just a reminder that this week, while the Prime Minister's overseas, only the Senate is sitting in Canberra. Once the House of Reps gets back, we're going to hear lots about that particular piece of legislation.
Sean, the latest news poll conducted by The Australian shows a fall in Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's approval ratings, though he remains well in front of opposition leader Peter Dutton.
He does. In the wake of the referendum defeat and the cost of living challenges, the gap between Labor and the coalition has narrowed to its closest margin since 2022. On primary vote, the coalition's actually leading Labor 37 to 35%. On the two-party preferred vote, which is probably more indicative of where the parties are sitting, Labor is sitting ahead at 52 to 48%. Last poll, it was actually 54 to 46%, so the gap is obviously narrowing. Albanese's personal approval has fallen below 50 points for the first time, down 5 points to 46%, but he's still well ahead of Peter Dutton, whose approval rating is 36%. Support for the Greens and Pauline Hanson's One Nation is broadly unchanged.
Sean, do you get the feeling that now's the time we start to talk about the next election?
I was just thinking that 18 months, so the last election was May, so that's 18 months ago. So we're at halfway point in this election cycle. So, yeah, I dare say we do start just paying a little bit more attention to what's going on.
Very interesting. And speaking of which, Sean, the Reserve Bank Board meets today with the consensus view being an increase in the official interest rate from 4.1 to 4.35%.
That means the standard variable home loan rate will be nearly 7%. If you have a $750,000 loan, you'll have to pay another $126 a month or so. That means the difference between your repayment in April last year and next week, assuming there's a rate hike and it's passed through quickly, is not far off $2,000 a month. That is a lot of money. But before we all start yelling and screaming, the goal is, of course, to reduce inflation, and these higher rates seem to be working. Australia started lifting rates later than most other countries, and somewhat comforting is the fact that a bunch of those countries are now at the point of keeping rates on hold, or they have, at least in their last central bank meetings. That includes countries like the US, the United Kingdom, Canada, the Eurozone. All those regions also have higher benchmark rates than Australia. Cold comfort? Probably.
And something to watch this afternoon around 2 o'clock, Sean. Everything starts getting interesting from the RBA announcement to the Melbourne Cup.
Well, the Melbourne Cup's, the RBA announcement's 2:30. I think the Melbourne Cup's 3 o'clock about. Yeah, it's quite the half hour, isn't it?
An hour of power, Sean. The temperature around Brookfield and EIG's near $20 billion bid for Origin is heating up, with the boss of the US firm EIG warning that Australian Super could become a stranded minority owner of the company.
In case you haven't been listening to Fear and Greed, a quick recap. Brookfield and EIG upped their bid for Origin last week by 7% to nearly $20 billion. AusSuper is Origin's biggest shareholder. After buying in recent days, it now has 15% of the company and reckons the price from the consortium, which is final, isn't enough. The two North American companies need 75% support in the shareholder vote in a little over 2 weeks' time. Origin share price closed yesterday at $8.53, which is exactly $1 less than the bid price. EIG's Blair Thomas said under the deal, EIG will buy Origin and then sell the energy markets business to Brookfield. That could result in the listed company just holding LNG assets. Now, if the deal is approved by shareholders, but AusSuper keeps its 15% stake, it could be left with a big chunk of the listed business, which is actually an LNG business. What Mr. Thomas was saying, is that really what AusSuper wants?
Very good question, Sean, and lots to follow in this story. Speaking of stories, it is Melbourne Cup Day, but has the race that stops the nation lost its zing?
Excellent question. Still plenty of money in racing, $900 million in prize money across the nation every year. You should listen to my interview with Tom Riley from the Thoroughbred Breeders Association after this show to get more details on that one. Today's race has $8 million in prize money. The winner gets $4.4 million. The second place getter gets $1.1 million. The jockey gets 5%, so the winning jockey presumably takes 5% of 4.4, which in my quick mathematics is about $220,000.
Oh,
Adam?
Impressive quick maths, Sean.
Yeah, I bet Michael Thompson would have got that wrong. Oh, I forgot about Michael Thompson.
I wonder if he's listening from Fiji.
The crowds at the races aren't quite what they used to be. There were no crowds in the COVID years. 10,000 people were allowed in 2021. Last year, just under 74,000 people turned up, or 73,816 to be exact. That was a record low. Now, I don't know whether you remember last year.
It was raining.
And there's a flood pretty much around Flemington.
Yeah.
If you've ever been to Flemington in the wet, you will understand. You take the tram out there and you see this incredible rain everywhere.
Sean, do you call that a heavy track?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Am I sounding like a racing fan now?
Yeah, you're sounding good.
Good.
Very, very impressive. Now, the record attendance for a cup is 123,000 spectators
Oh, my God.
in 2003. Actually, I think the record overall, I might get this wrong, it's about 107,000. It was a Derby Day, which is the weekend before Melbourne Cup, and that was about the 2015, 2016, something like that. Normally, well, for years, the Melbourne Cup got 100,000 plus spectators, but that really has come off. It hasn't been very good for ratings either, well, not as good. Channel 10 viewers last year, the number of viewers fell to 1.35 million. There was 1.75 million a couple of years ago. Kind of before 2015, it was about 3 million. So just whether or not the Melbourne Cup still is what it used to be, not so sure. But I've got to tell you, I have a tip for the race.
Okay.
Absurd.
Great name.
ABSURDE. I think that's very applicable for a show like Fear and Greed. Absurd.
I agree. I like
Everything's
it.
absurd.
So is that a Fear and Greed tip, Sean?
It's a Fear and Greed tip, not just me. It's a Fear and Greed tip.
All right. No one take that as a recommendation, just out of your interest, if you're having a flutter.
Not only are we not an investing podcast, we're also not a punters podcast.
Definitely not.
Yes.
Sean, moving on to international news. Israel's military yesterday said it had encircled Gaza City and the coastal strip is now divided in two.
It came as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken held surprise talks with the president of the Palestinian Authority amid a push by the US for a significant pause in the war in Gaza. Blinken also made an unscheduled stop in Baghdad. Meanwhile, there's been a jump in the number of Australians and their family members in Gaza needing assistance from the federal government. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is helping 79 people in the besieged region. And the World Health Organization said it has documented more than 100 attacks on the healthcare system in the Gaza Strip, as the Israeli military said Hamas fighters are using 2 additional hospitals in the enclave to conceal their operations.
Sean, China has pledged to expand access to markets and also boost imports, which have fallen this year.
Premier Li Qiang said China will continue to promote opening up with greater inclusiveness and benefit sharing. He was speaking at the China International Import Expo in Shanghai, which Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had attended. China's number 2 official said the country will actively expand imports and protect the rights and interests of foreign investors in accordance with the law. Now, foreign investment into China has turned negative for the first time since records began in 1998. These comments seem to be a direct reflection of that. Of course, greater access to markets, boosting imports, all that should be good for Australia.
Sean, Afghanistan is the world's leading producer of opium, and output levels have fallen 95% since Taliban authorities banned the crop, and that's according to a United Nations report.
Since returning to power in 2021, Taliban authorities have tried to end illegal drug production in Afghanistan, and in April 2022 banned the cultivation of the poppy plant from which opium and heroin are made. The report by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime found that poppy cultivation has collapsed from 233,000 hectares at the end of 2022 to just 10,800 hectares this year. Opium production has followed suit, plummeting from 5,624 tonnes to just 302 tonnes. The United Nations, though, warned of potential humanitarian consequences for many vulnerable rural communities due to the sudden contraction of Afghanistan's opium economy. Basically, growers relied on poppies to make an income. Now they've had to turn to far less lucrative alternative crops, according to a report in the AFP. Farmers' incomes are estimated to have fallen by 92% this year. So it's great to see less poppy production, but there's another side to that coin.
Yeah, the disruption flows through. Sean, up next is your Fear and Greed daily interview with Tom Riley from the Thoroughbred Breeders Association.
Most appropriate on Melbourne Cup Day. Most appropriate. It's a great chat with Tom. Good fella. Tells us all about the industry.
That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Adam. Good luck today.
Thank you, and to you too. It's Tuesday, the 7th of November, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X and Facebook. We hope you have a great day.